Hey everyone, thanks for watching How To Pixel, and this is the moment you've all been waiting for. The amazing hit movie, Revolutionize Your Light Show with the New Smart Receivers Part 1 of 2, has 101% fresh potato rating. So what did we do? We shockingly, unknowingly, totally unexpectedly, used lots of impact sound effects and made a Part 2. Revolutionize Your Light Show with the New Smart Receivers, the sequel. Learn everything about setting up receivers in Xlights using the visualizer. Then take a look at configuring the receivers on your controller using the output settings. Finally, gather some final useful tips all about smart receivers so you can become the differential receiver wizard. We can't stop using these impact sound effects. Revolutionize Your Light Show with the New Smart Receivers, the sequel, coming to theaters in 4.6 seconds. Hey everyone, thanks for watching How To Pixel, for real this time. And yes, today we are talking about smart receivers, part 2. Hopefully you enjoyed that intro because that took a while to make. But yes, we're continuing our talk all about smart receivers and how to use them. So if this is your first time tuning into the channel, or you haven't seen any of the other episodes revolving around receivers, first off, I'm Nick. Hi, welcome to the channel. And yes, there have been some other episodes related to receivers. This is technically part 3. Because part 1 was all about the basics about receivers, how they work, what are they used for, and I talked about how these work with certain controllers and some other things. And then I guess part 2 was the last video I posted, all about something called pixel port sharing. That video was also supposed to have all of this information in there too, but I thought it'd be too much packed into a video. And pixel port sharing is useful for a lot of other things besides receivers, so I thought it should be its own video. So that's why this is basically part 3. Now, if you haven't seen either of those other parts yet, I really recommend going back and starting off with part 1, so you don't miss anything we talked about with the receivers, and then also checking out pixel port sharing, because those two videos are going to be really useful for this video, and some things might not make sense, because I'm going to assume that you've already seen those before. And then hopefully, by the end of this part, you could be a differential receiver wizard. So here's what we're going to be talking about in today's video. Most of it is going to be the software end of receivers, because we already know how all the hardware works and stuff, but now we need to know how to set these up on our controller and in Xlights and all of that. So I'm going to start off showing how you set these up with your controller in Xlights, how you tell Xlights which mode your controller will be in, and how many receivers are attached to it, and also how to use the visualizer to put your props onto the receivers, so it's a lot easier than typing in all of the channel and universe numbers and all of that. Then after that, we'll also take a look at a controller's web interface and how you tell the controller you have receivers attached to it and any other types of expansions attached to it. And then finally, at the end of the video, I have a few other quick things I want to talk about before we wrap up everything about receivers. Because hopefully this should be the last part about smart receivers. Now in this video, I'm only going to be talking about how to set up receivers on V4 and V5 Falcon controllers. If you happen to have a V3 Falcon controller, I recommend checking out this video right here, or it might be on this side, one of the sides. Checking out that video. It's an older video I made, but it does show how to set up receivers on V3 controllers, because it is a little different with those controllers since they're older, but the V4 and V5 are very similar when setting up receivers. If you have any other types of controllers besides Falcons that you're trying to set receivers up on, the Xlights setup should be very similar if Xlights supports your controller, which it probably does. It has a very wide range of vendors it supports. But when I move on to the controller's web interface, it's probably going to be a little bit different than yours. So you may have to go look for some other information about how to set up receivers once you get to the controller. But the Xlights setup should be very similar. Now, like always, please feel free to use the timestamps in the scrub bar and in the description below, so you can skip to whatever part of the video you want to see. But with all that said, let's go take a look at Xlights and how you set up receivers in there. So I'm here in Xlights, and I'm in a show folder that I made just for this video. That way it looks like we're starting off completely from scratch. Now, the very first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to add an Ethernet controller so we can move all of the pixels and receivers and set up everything on there. Now, in this layout, I have 7 strands of 50 pixels, so these can act as 7 different props, and we can move all of these once we add a controller. So I'm going to hit the Add Ethernet button, and it's going to add an Ethernet controller. For those of you that don't know, almost all Pixel controllers are Ethernet controllers. Falcon controllers are Ethernet controllers. Culp boards, SAN devices, almost all Pixel controllers are Ethernet controllers. But I'm going to give this a name, and I'll call it main, caps lock on. I'll call it main controller. And then I'm also going to click this multicast button, just so this IP address box isn't yelling at us. All this is doing is, it was asking for an IP address of the controller, but we don't know it yet since we don't have one set up. So you could just select multicast while you don't have it right now. And then the next thing you need to do when you're setting up your controller is you need to tell Xlights which vendor and model controller you have. That way it makes everything so much easier when you're putting on all of the pixels and all that good stuff. It makes setup so much easier. So if you click this vendor box and click the arrow, these are all the different vendors that Falcon supports. So a lot of different Pixel controllers. We have a Falcon controller, and then we have to select the model. So first I'm going to show the F16v4, and then I'll also show the F16v5 and the F48v4. Now, if you have an F48v5, it will be the same setup as the F48v4. Xlights just doesn't have an option for it yet since it's a newer controller, but I assume within the near future they should add support for it. But I'll select F16v4, and then we get some new things that pop up. We have this variant box, this auto layout models, auto size, and full Xlights control options. You're going to want to make sure that all 3 of these checkboxes are clicked because it makes setting it up so much easier. What it does is it allows Xlights to do everything automatically for you, and when we get later down the road, it can upload the setup to your controller, but we'll talk about that later. And then this variant option, this is all the different modes that the controller can work in. So the F16v4 has 10 different modes it can run in. First is the 16 local ports. This is if you were just running the controller with nothing attached to it. Then you have 16 local ports plus the 2 smart receiver chains. So you'd select this if you want to use the onboard ports and the 2 built-in receiver outputs. 16 plus 16 local ports, that's the 16 onboard ports, and then a 16 port expansion, a local expansion. 16 plus 16 local ports plus 2 smart receiver chains is the same as the last one with a local expansion board and using the 2 smart receiver chains here. 16 local ports plus 4 smart receiver chains is the onboard ports and adding a differential expansion. 16 local ports plus 4 plus 2 smart receiver chains is the last one with the differential expansion and the 2 onboard receiver outputs. 16 plus 16 plus 16 local ports is 2 local expansion boards and the onboard ports. 16 plus 16 local ports plus 4 smart receiver chains is the local expansion and a differential expansion hooked up to it. And then 14 plus 4 smart receiver chains plus 16 local ports is the 16 onboard ports, then the differential receiver expansion, then the other 16 local port expansion, and then finally 16 local ports plus 4 smart receiver chains is the onboard ports and 2 differential expansions. So these are all of the different variants you can run this controller in. So it's a lot, but just find the one that you plan on using. If you have 2 expansion boards attached, you cannot use the 2 onboard smart receiver outputs because you'll have so many ports connected to it already that those will just be disabled. And then another thing we need to keep in mind is the pixel port sharing. If you remember from the last video, if any V4 or V5 controller has 32 ports or less attached to it, you can use 1024 pixels per port. But if you go over 32 ports and you use 33 to 48 ports connected to the controller, then you can only have 704 pixels per port. The only thing that doesn't count to how many ports you have is if you have a chain of receivers the extra receivers do not count as ports to the controller, since the pixels are split up across those receivers on the chain. If this doesn't make sense, I recommend watching the pixel port sharing video. But now for this example, I'm going to select the mode where it is 16 local ports, so the 16 onboard ports, and 4 smart receiver chains, so a differential receiver expansion connected to it. With this setup, it would only be 32 ports, which isn't going over 32 ports, meaning all of these ports can have 1024 pixels on them. Now the next step we need to do is we need to tell Xlights which props are going to be connected to the controller and on what ports or receivers if the controller has receivers on them. So this controller will have receivers and it will have 4 receiver chains. Now the way you do this is super easy. All you need to do is come down here to this visualize button, and if you open it, let me drag it over, it shows all of these ports right here, and it also shows all of your models right here. So we only have 7 models because I have these 7 single lines. And then if you look over here, we have 32 ports. The first 16 ports, those are the 16 local ports on the controller. And then the other 16 ports, so 17 to 32, these are the receiver ports. And every 4 ports is color-coded, so the first 4 is pink, then red, then green, then blue. So each group of 4 pixels goes to a receiver, and that's why the colors are there to help you see where the groups are. So 17 through 20, that goes to the first receiver chain. 21 to 24 goes to the second, 25 to 28 goes to the third, and 29 to 32 goes to the last one. We also have this serial port here, but we don't need to worry about it. This is just for DMX items, LOR things, or those types of items you want to connect to your controller over the serial output. Now let's start adding these props to the controller. So I'm going to start with single line 1, and let's say we want this to be on port 15. 15 is an onboard port. It's this port right here on the controller, and you can see because the controller labels them. So it's very simple to add it. All you need to do is hold left click and drag it over to whichever port you want it on. So I'm going to put it on 15. And there we go. And on the side, it will also show how many pixels total are on this port. So if I wanted both single line 1 and single line 2 on port 15, I can drag single line 2 onto single line 1, and now these will be chained together on the port 15 output. So it would look something like this. And if I wanted to swap them around so single line 2 is first in the strand, I can do that. I can move them around however I want. But I'm going to put single line 2 on its own port, port 16, and that's also an onboard port. And you can also take it back off the ports if you don't want it on there. Now let's say for single line 3, maybe this single line is very far away from the controller, so I want to put this one on a receiver chain. Well, I have 4 different receiver chains I can put it on. I can put it on the receiver that's for port 17 to 20, 21 to 24, and so on with the other 2. Let's put it on the first receiver, and I will put it on port 17, which goes to the first receiver. So if we were to look at that receiver, it would be port 1 on that receiver. So I simply just dragged it over, and now Xlights will know to send all of the data to port 17, which is receiver 1, since I told it to go to port 17. And then let's say single line 4 is also far away from the controller, but in the opposite direction. So we want to use another receiver for that one. Well, we don't want to put it on ports 18, 19, or 20, because those are ports 2, 3, and 4 on the first receiver chain. So we want to put it on the next group, which goes to the second receiver output. And I'll just put that on port 21. And since this is the first port in this group, that would mean port 1 on that receiver. So far, everything is pretty simple. We have some things on the onboard ports and some things on the receivers. But let's say now with single line 5, we want to put this on another receiver, but this receiver, we want to chain it to the first receiver on the first output. Well, how would we do that? If you remember correctly from the last video, I said that when you add multiple receivers on a chain, those ports don't get new port numbers. It would now go 17, 18, 19, 20A for these ports, and then 17, 18, 19, 20B for these ports, and it would continue on the more receivers you put onto the chain. So what we need to do is tell Xlights that we want this single line 3 on port 17A, and then we want this single line 5 on 17B, which would mean that these are on 2 separate receivers. 17A would go to the first receiver and 17B would go to the second one. So it's very simple to do this. All you need to do is right click the prop and then come down to this smart remote option, and you could see the 6 different letters we could assign it to, which are the 6 different receivers in the chain. Right now it's set to no letter because it's going to be acting as the receivers are in normal mode or dumb mode, meaning you can't chain them. But since we do want to chain these, I'm going to have to switch this first one to A. And if I click that, look at that. It makes all 4 ports on this receiver output now A. So I could add some more props to these other ports, and if I put them on A, that would go to the first receiver, since the first receiver is A. Now we want single line 5 on 17B. So if we drag it over, you'll notice it puts it on 17A. And with this currently, Xlights thinks that what you're going to do is only use port 17A for these 2 props, and you'll have line 3 first, and then line 5 attached to line 3. We don't want that. We want line 5 on 17B, which is a completely separate port on another receiver. So now we could just right click it again, go to smart remote and select B, because we want it on receiver B, not A. And if we do that, look at that. It adds another row of B to all the 4 ports that goes to those receivers. So now Xlights knows that single line 3 is on 17A on receiver A, and single line 5 is on 17B, which is on receiver B. Now we could take these other props and I could attach them to 18B or 18A, 19A or 19B, and whatever I want. Or if we had a third receiver in the chain, we could add that to here. It's going to first link up to B. We don't want that. So let's go to smart remote and set it to C. And now we have A, B, and C available. And if we wanted to, I could go all the way up to F. So I'm going to keep adding props to this port, and I'll change this one to D, which is next. So now we have A, B, C, D. Let's move this one to E, and it's going to link up with D, but let's change it to E. So now we have A, B, C, D, E. And let's put this final one on here. It's going to link up with E again, but we can change it to F. And now what this would look like is 6 receivers on this chain, and each prop would be connected to port 17 on those receivers. So it would be 17A for line 3, 17B for line 5, 17C for line 6, and then so on with the rest. And then if you look here, it shows how many pixels are on port 17. Now, there's technically not 300 pixels on each port, but there's 300 pixels across all of the 17 ports. If you remember in the last video, I was talking about how all of the port groups, so all of the 17 ports, all of the 18 ports, 19 ports, any port groups on a receiver, all of those ports of the same number combined cannot go over the max pixels per port. Right now, the max pixels per port is 1024, since we're in 32 port mode. And we could see we're at 300, that doesn't go over the 1024 limit, so we're fine. But if I added more props to like port B and chain them off of single line 5 or any of the other ports, if this got over 1024, now it wouldn't work because we've reached the limit. And if you're in like 48 port mode, the limit is 704 pixels now. So just remember the limit, and Xlights makes it very easy to see how many pixels you have on the ports. So make sure the pixels do not go over the limit. But I'm going to remove some of these from here. I'm going to set them to none, and it will give me this error if I ever put a prop on a port that is a smart port, because right now it's smart because it has multiple receivers chained. If I put a prop on that's set to be in not smart mode, dumb mode, it will turn red and you'll get an error because you can't have dumb and smart things mixed together. So I'm just going to take some of these off. I'll set this to none. Now the other thing I wanted to talk about before we move on to the next controller is if you have an SRX2 or an SRX4 receiver, you need to remember that those receivers count as 2 or 4 receivers. So it's like having two receivers on one chain. So I'm going to just take these off. And if we had an SRX2 receiver that has 8 ports, those would not consume 8 ports here because you can't have 8 ports in one group. The receiver outputs go by groups of ports of 4. So it wouldn't take 8 ports here. What it would instead do is take these 4, make these 17A, 18A, 19A, and 20A, and then it would add another 4 for 17B, 18B, 19B, and 20B. So let's say I have an SRX2 receiver connected to this receiver output. And then let's say I wanted single line 1 to go on this port. This port is port 17, since it is the very first port on the receiver. And if we look at the very first port that goes to that output, it's 17. So I'm just going to drag this onto port 17. Okay. And now 17, 18, 19, and 20 go to these first 4 ports. If we wanted to take use of these other 4 ports, whatever props we want to put on there need to be set to go to receiver B, because this is technically receiver A here, and this is receiver B here, since this counts as 2 receivers. So if I wanted single line 2 on this port is 20B. So what I would do is just drag it to 20 and set smart remote to B. And then this one needs to be put on a smart remote, and this one's going to be put on A, because this port, these first 4 ports are A ports since it's considered receiver A, and these last 4 are on the B ports since it's considered receiver B. I do understand it's really confusing, but just try and remember that this is not 1 receiver right here. This is 2 receivers. And same with the SRX4. This is 4 receivers. So I would need to have ports 17 A, B, C, and D, since this is receiver A, B, C, D. This is why it's very important to make sure that you know your ABCs in preschool, because they come in use later in life. But that is how you add props to these ports. And this is the exact same for all the other controllers. You just may have more or less ports depending on which mode you're in, and the ports might be for receivers or onboard ports. So I'm going to close this, and I'm going to change this now to the F16v5, because that's the next one I'll talk about. Now when I select the F16v5, you'll notice that the variant setting goes away. That's because the F16v5 has no variant. If you look at the board, there's the 16 onboard ports and the 4 receiver outputs that act as a differential expansion built in. But you cannot attach any other expansions or receivers other than to these 4 outputs. So this controller is always in 32 port mode because you can't attach any more than 32 ports to it. So all these ports can always run 1024 pixels. But because of this, that means there's no variant, so you don't have to change that setting. The receiver outputs will always be on and be able to output data, and you don't really have to disable them. There's no reason to, even if you aren't using receivers. Now, if we open up the visualizer for this controller, it's actually the exact same as the last example, because the last example had 32 ports. This one also has 32 ports. So you would do the same thing where you just take the models and move them over to the ports you want them on. Now, something I will mention is if I wanted to put single line 4 on port 5, which is an onboard port, I still have the option to set a smart remote ID to it. So I could set it to C if I wanted to. Make sure that if these are local ports, you do not give them an ID. Because since they're local ports, they're not meant to be used for receivers. They're literally just ports already there. So if you give them an ID, they won't work correctly. So make sure they're set to none if they are on a local port. And ports 1 to 16 are the local ports. Now if I move this to any other port besides those, like port 18, that's a receiver port, and that's fine then. If I'm having a chain of receivers, I can tell this one which remote it's on. If it's on A, B, C, D, whatever. And I'm not going to add any models to this one because it's exactly the same as the other example. But now if I select the F48v4, and this is going to be, like I said, the exact same for the F48v5. So you can follow along if you have an F48v5. The variant setting comes back, but you only have 2 options. You have 4+4+4 smart receiver chains or 4+4 smart receiver chains. 4+4 that is if you're running the controller in 32 port mode. And like I talked about in the last video, if you set the controller to this mode, the middle 4 receiver outputs will be disabled and you can only use the other 8 remaining. However, this allows you to have 1024 pixels per port since you're in 32 port mode. 4+4+4 smart receiver chains enables all the receiver outputs on the F48, so you can use any of them, but you are now limited to 704 pixels per port. So for this example, I'll set it to 4+4+4 smart receiver chains, and if we open the visualizer, now you'll see we have 48 total ports. And all of these ports are receiver ports since there are no onboard ports. Well, there are the 4 onboard ports that act as a receiver, and I'll talk about those in a second. But basically, there is no onboard ports. So any prop you put onto any of these ports, you can give it an ID to which smart remote it's on because they're all smart receiver outputs. If it's going to be the only receiver on a chain, then you don't need to worry about giving it an ID. But if there's 2 or 3 or 4, you need to tell it which receiver to go to. And all of the pixels that are on each of these ports, no matter which receiver they're on, like I said, if they go to the same port, that port cannot go over the limit. And the limit right now is 704 since we're in 48 port mode. And now another thing that's exactly like the other controllers, the ports are split up into groups of 4. So the first 4 are a group, the second 4 are a group, and you can tell by the colors, and that helps you to remember where these ports go. So the first group of 4 ports goes to the first receiver output, the second group goes to the second one, the third group goes to the third one, and so on. And the controllers are usually labeled too, so you can tell which ports are on that output. So you could just move your props over here normally like you would, like I showed in the other examples. But I also want to talk about how to use the 4 onboard ports. I sort of talked about this in the last video, but these act as a receiver directly connected to the final receiver output. So these always copy what this output is doing. So even if I'm only using a receiver on this output, I don't want to use the onboard ports, I could still connect pixels to these ports and they'll just be copying what the receiver does. So if I don't want to use a receiver there and I want to use pixels on those 4 ports, I would come down to the final 4 ports, 45, 46, 47, 48. These go to both this output and the 4 pixel ports. So if I want single line 2 on port 1 on the onboard ports, I'm going to put that to the first port in the final group, which is port 45. So now this prop will go to both this port and the receiver ports, so you could use either one you want. Now this also means technically if you wanted to, you could use 2 of the onboard ports and then have the other 2 go to the receiver, because let's say now I want single line 4. I want this one to go to a receiver port on that final output. If I put this on port 48, I could attach a receiver here, and now both this port and this port will be sending the exact same data, so I could connect single line 4 to either of those. Or if I wanted 2 strands of pixels to do the exact same thing, I could hook a strand of pixels here, and they would just receive the same data. So just remember that these 4 ports on the controller act as a differential receiver directly connected to this output. Now I do want to talk about one final thing that is decently confusing, so I'm going to try and make it easy to understand. If I was to, let's just close that out, and I'm going to go to 4+4 smart receiver chains. This would mean I'm only using 32 ports, and I'm using these 4 receiver outputs and these 4 receiver outputs. So you'd think if we open the visualizer, it would show ports 1 to 16, skip 17 to 32 since those are now disabled, and then show 33 to 48. Well, it doesn't. If you open up the visualizer, it shows ports 1 to 32. And technically, 32 and anything between 17 and 32 goes to these 4 receiver outputs. So what the heck happens here if these 4 are supposed to be disabled? Well, the first 16 ports, those are correct. Those go to the proper receiver outputs like normal. But then the 4 groups of the other 16 ports, those now get bumped down to the other 4 receiver outputs. So to make it easy to understand, any port that's 17 or above, just add 16 to it, and that's technically the actual port it's going to. So 17, 18, 19, 20, when you're in 32 port mode, these technically go to 33, 34, 35, and 36, which is this receiver output here. And then if you were to use the onboard pixel ports, you would now attach those to 29, 30, 31, and 32, because if you add 16 to those are technically 45, 46, 47, and 48. So it's a little or a lot confusing. It can be hard to understand it at first, but just remember that these ports now get bumped down to the final receiver output row. You'll also need to remember this when you look at the web interface on an F48 that's in 32 port mode, because the web interface of the controller will also only show ports 1 to 32, not 1 to 16, skip 17 to 32, and then show 33 to 48. It will just show 1 to 32. But that is how you put the pixels on your controllers and on your receivers in Xlights. Now we're going to want to make sure you hit save when you're done with it, so you don't lose anything you set up. And then next, we need to tell the controller basically everything we told Xlights. Because Xlights can properly prepare the data now, but now the controller needs to know how to read that data and which ports to send that data to. So that's why we have to set up the controller next. So there are two different ways you can set up the controller to read all of that data from Xlights. And one method is really easy to do, and the other method is a little bit harder. The easy method is letting Xlights do all of the work for you, because Xlights has a way that you can automatically upload all of that configuration you just did in the visualizer to the controller. So basically copy and paste what you did in the visualizer onto the controller. And it's a really easy method to do because you don't need to type in all of the channel numbers, universe numbers, pixel counts into the controller, and it just saves a lot of time. But I also recommend watching the more difficult method, which is doing it manually. And the reason for that is so you know what is going on in the output settings. Because sure, you can have Xlights do all the work, but then when you go to look on it, you might be confused seeing all the different things it put on there. So I really recommend watching the manual part that I'll talk about in a little bit, just so you can see if Xlights fails for some reason or something isn't uploaded right. Maybe you need to change something, you know what to look for. Because if you let Xlights do all the work, then you don't really understand what it's doing. So that's why I recommend watching the harder method. Now, I'm not saying don't use the easy method, because I still use it, but I also know what's going on in the controller's web interface. So if I need to fix something, I can do that. So let's go take a look at those two methods, and we'll start with the easy method and letting Xlights do all the work and uploading the configuration to the controller. So I have my controller open right here on my web browser. It's on this IP address right here. And this is an F16v5. And all of the setup I'm going to be showing on just the F16v5 because I don't have the other controllers. However, the setup is almost exactly the same. All of the settings are in the same spot. You just have to set it up differently depending on what you're using in your setup. So if we go to the pixel output settings, right now you'll see I have absolutely nothing set up. It's like we just got the controller from a factory reset. So if we go into Xlights and we click the controller, and I'm actually going to quickly switch this back to an F16v5, and I'm going to go into the visualizer and set up a few things. Let's put a line on port 15, a line on port 16, and then we'll do some stuff here, and I'll add some differential receivers. Okay, so I'm going to save this, so this is all set up for an F16v5. Now, to make the easy method work, there's just a few things you have to do. First is you need to make sure your controller is booted up and connected to the same network as your computer Xlights is running on. And then you also need to tell Xlights the IP address of the controller. So I'm going to disable multicast and put in the IP address of my controller, which is 192.168.1.240. And then you also need to make sure, like I showed earlier, these three checkboxes are enabled. But now that we have the controller powered up, it's on the same network, and I put in the IP address, now we could come down here to this upload output button. And it's super easy. All you do is literally just click it, and then we let it load. It takes a few seconds sometimes. And there we go. It's done. And if you look all the way down at the bottom of the screen, it says Falcon output upload complete. So if we go back to the web interface of the controller and I refresh the page, look at that. It already set up everything for us. We can see it put the single lines on port 15 and 16 on the onboard ports. Then it set up differential receiver chains, and it did everything. It put in the channel counts, the pixel counts, all of it, so we don't have to worry about it. And this upload output button, this works for almost any type of controller. Xlights supports lots of different types of controllers, and you can upload the output for all of Falcon controllers, cult boards, there's lots of different controllers that you can automatically upload the output for. But now, let's go take a look at how we would do it manually and see what's going on in there, so we know how we can do it if we can't upload the output, if something fails, if we want to change something. So I'm going to come back here and hit this clear all button so it resets it, and I'm going to hit save. So it looks like we're starting off from scratch again. Now all of these instructions I show, these apply for the V4 and V5 Falcon controllers, and should apply to any new controllers too that come out in the future, as long as not too much changes. So the very first thing is you're going to want to come to the status page, and there's this setting right here, and it's the board configuration setting again. So before you do anything, you're going to want to tell the controller what configuration it's in. So on my F16v5, there's actually no options. You have to stay with the one, because like I said, there's nothing to expand to it or change the configuration. It's always set for the 16 onboard ports, the local ports, and the 4 smart receiver chains. Now if you were on an F16v4, all of those 10 options that I showed in Xlights would be available again, so you could select those depending on your setup. Or if you had an F48 V4 or V5, it would give you 2 options, and it would be the 4+4 receiver chains, aka 32 port mode, or the 4+4+4 receiver chains, aka 48 port mode. And then once you have this set up, which I don't need to set, there's only the one option, but once you do that, you're going to want to go to the output settings again and go back to the pixel output settings. Now this should look very similar for everyone, you just may have different ports. So for the F16v5, it's always going to be 32 ports. If you're using an F48, it might show up 32 ports, it might show up 48 ports. It depends on what the configuration is in. And then for the F16v4, it could be 16 ports, it could be 24, 32, 40, or 48. It just depends on the configuration. So here we have the 16 onboard ports, and you could set up the universes, the channels, and the pixel counts right here for them. And I'm actually not going to explain how universes and channels work in this video, because I have a whole separate video I recommend you watch up here. I'll leave a link to it. This is mainly just showing how to add receivers and receiver chains to the controller. So I could set up my onboard pixel ports here, but if we come down to this other section with the other 16 ports, these are for the receiver outputs. And if you remember from earlier, each 4 ports goes to a separate receiver output. So the first 4 ports, 17, 18, 19, 20, those are ports 1, 2, 3, 4 on the first receiver. And then 21, 22, 23, 24, those are also 1, 2, 3, 4, except on the second receiver output. And then same with the rest of them. So if I had this receiver and I wanted to run 50 pixels on port 2 on the first receiver output, that would be the first block of 4 ports, and that would be port 18, since that's the second port in the block. And I'd come over here and set it up how I normally would. I'd put in the pixel count for not 500, but 50. And then I would set up the start universe and start channel to what it's set up in Xlights with. This is where the upload output is useful from Xlights, because it will fill in the universes and channels, so you don't need to go back and forth looking at the different numbers. So it's pretty straightforward. You could just add more pixels to the receivers. But all of these receivers are in dumb mode right now, or in normal mode, meaning you can only have 1 on each output. So how do you add multiple receivers on one output? Well, it's pretty simple. We have the 4 receiver outputs here with 4 ports in each, and you'll notice each group has a blue plus sign next to it. All of the ports have a black plus sign, but that's for something called virtual strings, which is another video we can talk about later. But the blue plus signs are to increase how many receivers are on each output. So if we press it once, it actually doesn't increase it first. It converts it to a smart receiver. And you can see it says it here, smart receiver 17 to 20A. So we have ports 17A, 18A, 19A, 20A. And this would go to the first receiver on a chain. Now, if we hit the plus button again, now we have two receivers. We have receiver A up here and receiver B. And these are both connected to the first output. So we have 17A, 18A, 19A, so on, and 17B, 18B, 19B, and so on. And then we could add another receiver, so this is receiver C, and then we could add D, and then we could add E, and then we get to F, and then the plus sign disappears because you can only have up to 6 receivers. So, all of these 24 ports, this group of 4, 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 and this group of 4, these all are 6 receivers chained on the first output. And then we still have the other 3 outputs right here, which we could also increase by pushing the plus button to add more receivers to those chains. And then if you want to remove receivers, you could push the minus button. And let's say I only want 2 receivers on this chain. So we have receiver A here and receiver B here. Now we need to remember, since we're adding receivers to this chain, that the pixels that the original 17, 18, 19, and 20 ports get, they must now be shared with the other receivers on the chain. So 17A and 17B, those need to share 1024 pixels. 18A and 18B need to share the limit. 19B and 19A and 20A and 20B also need to share the limit. For me, the limit's 1024, but if you have a controller with over 32 ports on it, the limit would be 704. And I talked about this in the last video, V4 and V5 controllers don't care how you split up the pixels between the different ports, as long as you just don't go over the limit. So on 18A, I have 50 pixels. Let me just increase that to 500. And then on 18B, I could have another 500, or not 5,000, another 500, and it doesn't light up red. That's because you're staying under the limit, so the controller's happy. I could also change this to 200, and then have 18B be set for 800. And it still doesn't light up red because it's happy. That's only 1000 pixels total on the 18 ports. So it's under the 1024 limit. It doesn't care. And if I wanted to, I could set 18A to 0 and have 1024 on 18B. And look, it's still happy because I'm not over the 1024 limit. Now, if I even add one single pixel here, it's going to light up red because now the ports combined have gone over the limit. So just make sure not to go over the limit. And I'm just going to say this again to make it clear. This is not over all of the ports that this limit applies to. This is just ports 18 right here that I'm talking about. And then ports 17 share a limit, ports 19 share a limit, and then ports 20 share a limit. So each of the numbers get a separate 1024 pixels to share. It's just if I add more receivers, or even if I only have 2, all of the 19 ports have to share a limit, the 18 ports share a limit, the 17 ports share a limit, and so on. And it's the exact same for all of the other ports. And what do we do now if we have an SRX2 or an SRX4 receiver? Well, like I talked about, those count as 2 receivers in one board. So it's very simple. We would just set this to smart mode and then set 2 receivers. Right now we have A and B. So this is what we need to do for an SRX2 receiver, because half of the ports are here and then the other half are there. Now if we have an SRX4, that counts as 4 receivers in one board. So receiver A, B, C, D. So we need to have A, we have B, and now we have C, and I'll push the plus sign one more time, and now we have D. So these 16 ports would go to that receiver. And if you had an SRX1 receiver first, that would be A, and then the other 4 receivers on the SRX4 would now go B, C, D, E. So we'd have to add one more smart receiver to this chain. So it isn't extremely complicated. When you're adding just one single receiver to a chain, it's very easy. You don't need to do anything. Just type in how many pixels are going to be on the ports for those receivers. When you have a chain of receivers, you need to add the plus button to increase the count of receivers, and you need to remember pixel port sharing from the last video. And then one other thing I'd like to point out is you can see the onboard ports don't have blue plus buttons. So if you're ever confused trying to figure out what are onboard ports and what are receiver outputs, you could look for the blue plus sign. And if you don't see them, that means that that section is for onboard ports. Now on the F48, each group of 4 ports, even the first ones, would have a blue plus sign because all of the ports are receiver outputs. And this setup applies to any V4 or V5 controller. It's exactly the same, and it's somewhat similar to also V3 controllers, but there are some things that are different. So you can follow along even if you don't have an F16v5. You can do exactly what I did, but you don't even have to do it this way. Like I said, you can use the auto upload from Xlights. It's just good to know how this is happening and what's going on in here. So we are very close to being done with our talk about receivers. We now know how to set them up in Xlights and also how to set them up on the controller. Now there are just a few other little tips and pieces of information I want to talk about when using these. Some things that I forgot to say in other videos or that just didn't fit in a certain section. So first, I had someone leave a comment on the last receiver video talking about the ID when you are giving them the name A, B, C, D down the line for chains of receivers. Now the way I was explaining it, I was saying that they have to be in order from A, B, C, D down the line. But that is actually not true. I recommend, if you're new to receivers, keeping them in order because it's a lot easier to keep everything in line with what you're doing. But you can have it go C, A, E, F. It doesn't have to go in order. You have to just set it up in your controller's web interface and in Xlights so you know which pixels are on which ID receiver. And you'd also have to change the mode switch for whatever ID receiver this is. But like I said, it's simpler if you keep it going A, B, C, D if you're new to this so you don't get confused. Another piece of information, I left a pinned comment in the last differential receivers video, but I just wanted to make sure I talk about this too in case anyone didn't see it. On the V5 receivers, whether it's this one or the other V5 receiver, if you push the test button once, it resets the fuses. So you have to hold the test button to enable test mode. But if any of the fuses ever blow and the pixel ports go out, you can just push the test button once to automatically fix the fuse. That way you don't have to power it down then power it back on or use the web interface. Helpful tip number 3. In the very first video with differential receivers, I was talking about how you can place these up to 250 feet away. But there is something important I forgot to talk about. These don't really have like any data booster for the Ethernet cables in them. So the entire length of the whole chain has to stay under 250 feet. So if you put this receiver, this is the first receiver on a chain at 250 feet, you can't chain anymore because the data can't go that far. So by putting an Ethernet cable in and then going to the next one, that's not increasing the range. So in a chain of like 4 receivers, all 4 receivers have to be within 250 feet. And then helpful tip number 4. Lots of people have been telling me this and I've tried correcting it in other videos. Sometimes I still forget to talk about it. I say Ethernet cables when I'm talking about what connects into here. Ethernet cables are also considered RJ45 cables, or sometimes people call them like Cat5 cables, Cat6 cables, whatever. But these connectors down here where you put in the data are actually not Ethernet ports. I know I've talked about this before. These are considered RJ45 jacks. They take an Ethernet cable, and you can use an Ethernet cable, but they don't call them Ethernet ports because Ethernet is wrapped around internet data and that type of stuff. Whereas we're not doing anything with internet data, we're sending pixel data to these. So that's why they call them RJ45 jacks. So don't connect these to anything that use internet, like a router or a Raspberry Pi or a computer. These have to be directly connected to a controller that supports them. But I think that's going to be everything for these receivers. I've had the idea for a long time now to make a receivers video. I didn't expect for it to take 3 parts. But I'm hoping I got all the information you need to use these in these videos. And if you have any questions or comments at all, like I always say, if you have any tips for me to change up how I'm talking about these videos to make them easier to understand, or if you need to correct me on anything, please leave any of those things in the comment section down below. Hopefully by now you can go out to the world and connect up differential receivers to your controller and make it easier to connect pixels that are all over your display. These are really handy boards, and I recommend checking them out if you ever get the chance. But that's going to conclude it for this video, and that's going to conclude it for this little 2/3 part smart receiver series. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.